Sergeant Ann Odell is a 19-year veteran of the San Diego Police Department. She's had different positions with the police department, including crime prevention, narcotics officer, patrol officer, media relations, background investigations, and in the domestic violence unit. She's a domestic violence trainer for the San Diego Regional Police Academy, the prosecutors in the city attorney's domestic violence unit, judges in the municipal, superior, and family courts, and social services personnel. She provides training for shelter workers, military police, and investigators, the National College of District Attorneys, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and the California District Attorney Association. She has worked with training with the San Diego Police Domestic Violence Council, medical practitioners, San Diego Police Department, and California Post, the Peace Officers Standards and Training. She developed and implemented the Domestic Violence Investigation Unit. This unit is the first of its kind in major law enforcement. She supervises a staff of 25 to 30 people that work in the unit. She authored the Preliminary Investigation Manual, which is in use in the San Diego Police Department Academy. She is co-author of the article, Stopping the Violence, the Role of the Police Officer and the Prosecutor. She has been qualified as a court expert in domestic violence. She is a member of the San Diego County Domestic Violence Task Force, the YWCA Battered Women's Service, the Center for Women's Studies and Services, and the Navy and Marine Domestic Violence Task Force. She is currently the coordinator and sergeant of the Domestic Violence Unit for the San Diego Police Department. She is the mom of 6 kids, 21 to 29, and she's the granny of 5. Please join me in welcoming Sergeant Ann Odell.
Thank you very much. Well, at least you know now that I'm very prolific in children, if nothing else. I want to begin by showing you about 3 minutes from a tape which was produced by a state agency in California, which is, as Judy referred to it, called POST, which stands for Peace Officer Standards and Training. This film is available. It does run for 2 hours, but I won't run it for 2 hours now. I want to use the open of it for a very special reason. If you're interested in obtaining a copy of this film, you can see me after the session, and I'll give you the phone number for POST, which is located in Sacramento. So bear with me. I'm not a mechanical person. I will try to make this happen correctly.
You want to fucking play games? I'll fucking play games. Call my mom and fucking do that shit. Call your mom and dad. I'll fucking fuck them up too. I've never lose, baby. Think about Pally, baby. Dead. Dead. You'll fucking find yourself in a goddamn grave. You want to play big games with me. Sending emergency.
My mommy is having a fight.
Is she getting hurt? Okay, we're going to be there. We'll take it. 911 emergency room? What's an emergency? What's the emergency there?
It's some domestic abuse.
Is he white, black, Hispanic, Oriental?
He's white, he's law enforcement, he probably has...
Wait a minute, what do you mean law enforcement? What is he?
Patrol. He's got a restraining order against him. He was just inside my house, and he hit me when he was in.
I heard that, yes.
Did you hear him slap me?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. My kids are freaking out. Help me! What happened? He brought it in the garden. Please help me! He's gonna break the door. Please! Okay, what happened? Please help me! officer to tell my parents.
All right, listen to me.
Oh, God, no one's coming in to get us.
All right, I'm getting the police right over there. They're on their way now. Okay, is the door locked?
No.
Is he in the garage?
He's in the house now.
What is he doing?
He's right standing right here right next to me with the gun.
Could you turn that off, please? You know, over the last 4 years, I've seen this tape almost 100 times, and it never fails to get to me because it's real life. These aren't actors or anything. I like to play this tape because I want there to be no question in your minds what domestic violence is really all about. It's not about a power struggle between men and women, and it's not about a lover's spat. What it is about is criminal conduct that leads all too often in this country to homicide and/or suicide. And it is a crime that affects not just the two people, but everybody around them, and goes on for generation after generation without our intervention. In fact, this is where we breed our future batterers and our future victims, in the home. I became a patrol cop in 1975, 19 years ago. Young, naive, wanted to change the world. I was 30 years old, but young, a lot younger than I am now. And I look back to when I worked patrol for 7.5 years, and I remember with shame how badly we handled domestic violence in those days. We didn't look, we didn't investigate, we didn't ask the right questions, and we didn't listen at all. We really didn't. To us, it was just a family beef. Our job was to get in and out and fix the situation as quickly as possible. The reality is, sometimes we were more hurtful to the victim than we were helpful when we arrived. We re-victimize victims. I clearly remember pointing my finger at people and saying, if I have to come back here one more night, somebody's going to jail. Maybe both of you will go to jail. And when I looked at the woman, I would say, and I'll take your kids away for the night. That's how we fixed the problem. The point was, we didn't see what was going on. We completely missed what was happening. I describe it in the academy today as when we arrive, we see this tiny little sliver of what's going on in this relationship. And if we don't investigate any further, we miss all kinds of information. We didn't see trauma to anybody, especially kids. We never saw the hidden injuries, nor did we look for the hidden injuries. And some of us joked about it. I had a co-worker in my squad who used to clear family disturbance calls and say to the dispatcher, well, ALG ain't love grand. And that's how he dealt with it. And we also did that proverbial thing of victim blaming. Without fail, we would look at these people with disdain and contempt, especially the victim. And I need to tell you that wasn't just male officers. Certainly male officers did that. Male officers have been taught from being young boys to feel not only superior, but always to take control of situations. So they never could put themselves in the place of this woman who would stay with a man who would abuse her time after time. And female officers fell into the category of what I describe as holier than thou. You know something? As a female, I'd never let a guy slap me. I would never put up with any of that crap. The problem was, it wasn't true. I mean, today on our department, we have both batterer and victims, and they wear uniforms. We didn't like DV calls. They were a distraction. We wanted to do real police work. I mean, real police work was chasing stolen cars. That happened to be my favorite. I loved pursuits. Had something to do with adrenaline or something. I may have been a junkie as far as that goes. Or making drug arrests. After all that, that's real police work. That's what we describe as sexy police work. Domestic violence, that's not sexy police work. And the way that we commonly explained the disdain and contempt we had for the call was this way. We would always say, you know, this is the most dangerous call of all. It is not the most dangerous call of all. You need to know that if you learn nothing else before you leave this seminar. I am not suggesting that there aren't calls that are dangerous. The most recent death of an officer in our city 2 years ago was at a domestic violence call. The reality is, when you look at the entire country, intervention in domestic violence is the number 4 reason for officers getting killed or injured out of a list of 9. And it wasn't something we all tried to do, but the Department of Justice for a long time grouped all disturbance calls together, and they could be family disturbance, bar fight, gang fight, etc. But all of a sudden that kind of got translated into domestic violence calls, and I think it was a handy excuse to say why we didn't like them. I think for some of us what we were seeing was too close to home to bear. The bottom line, though, is that we have learned a lot and we've grown a lot over the years. What I'd like to tell you about is how it happened on my department. To give you the proper perspective, the first thing you should know is San Diego is the 6th largest city in the United States. We have 1.3 million people in our city. Our police department has 1,922 officers. That's a lot of officers to try to change in terms of their attitude and their behavior about domestic violence. And we've made it happen. So the message here is, if we can do it with almost 2,000 cops, you can do it in any agency across this country. The way it started was in 1986. In 1986, California, like many other states, and perhaps your state across the country, adopted strong new laws regarding domestic violence. And I would like to be able to stand here and say it's because we all became enlightened about the issue, but that would be a lie. The reality is that Tracy Thurman was involved in an unprecedented lawsuit that would forever impact the way law enforcement would respond to DV. You may have heard of her story. Tracy Thurman was a battered wife who left her husband. And after 2 years of back and forth, getting beaten up by him, going to the local police agency for help, he finally stabbed her and kicked her in the head as she lay on the ground. He nearly killed her. In fact, today she is technically a quadriplegic. And her husband, by the way, is out on parole. He lives about 45 miles from her. I think he did 8 years in prison. The bottom line was that Tracy Thurman sued the Torrington, Connecticut Police Department for violation of her civil rights because they had just been treating it as a family beef, no more. The reality, though, was Torrington, Connecticut was not too awfully different from the rest of us. They were just the people who got hit first with the lawsuit. And that lawsuit led to insurance companies putting pressure on municipalities to train their officers correctly, or they would withhold coverage. And that's how come we all woke up to the issue of DV. What we had been doing prior to that is typical, I think, across the country. Get in, get out, diffuse, mediate the situation. In extreme cases, maybe take the guy aside and tell him to walk around the block and cool off, as if 20 minutes could make a difference. And we had the audacity, and I think the naivete, to think that if we shook our fist at the guy and said, you know, you don't want to do this anymore, I'm going to have to do something drastic next time, that would really be a message that a batterer would get. We just didn't understand that the minute we left, he was back there and she got it twice as bad. In fact, during those years, we used arrest as a last resort. We didn't want to make arrests. We didn't want to stop the money coming in. We didn't want to separate the man from his family, all those things. However, in 1986, new mandates came into law in California. And the first of those mandates was that all law enforcement agencies should adopt and implement a policy on their department that all officers had to adhere to when they responded to domestic violence. The second mandate required all law enforcement officers in the state of California to receive 8 hours of training in the issue. And the third mandate was, you shall write reports of every domestic violence incident that you respond to. I remember the original training that we received in 1986. It was kind of apologetic in tone, if you will. I use the term, aw shucks, guys, it's the law, we gotta follow it, we may not like it, but we've gotta do it because we're professional. And there were a lot of mixed messages, which brings me to this point. Whoever you pick to choose, pick to do your training in your local law enforcement agency, make sure you pick the right person. And let me give you an actual story about what happened when I went to training. The sergeant who trained us was standing in front of a group of about 50 of us, and he said, you know, when the chief was looking through the roster to figure out who was going to train on domestic violence, they were looking for volunteers or people they could get to be volunteers, and they came to my name and they said, so-and-so, remember his wife, the bitch? And that's how the training started. Talk about a mixed message. Do you think we were really going to take in much of what we heard after that? And I don't think my department was the only one that had that kind of thing happen in it. Well, for the next 4 years in my department, officers started to write reports. Admittedly, they were not very good reports. They were fairly short, simple, maybe a couple paragraphs, not a lot of detail, not a lot of documentation, as Lisa was referring to, not a lot of investigation, because you still didn't really think of it as a crime. I mean, we were having to write it up, but you know, it's not like real crime. So we did these reports over the next 4 years. In 1990, though, we really did take a giant step forward, and it's something that I recommend to all areas, whether they're rural or urban or whatever they are. We did, on my department, under pressure, I might add, from our domestic violence task force, which Casey, you heard Casey earlier, chaired. They had strongly recommended that the police department that I work for, which is the largest of 9 agencies in the county of San Diego, create a position of domestic violence coordinator. One person who would be charged with the responsibility of learning about this issue and training all members on the department. Well, my chief did that. And when he did it, I think that coordinator position was like the 3rd one in the country. I knew New York City had one, but it just wasn't the typical thing for police departments. We started to do research in our department about our response to domestic violence, and I won't go into all the details about how we did it because I talked about it in a workshop yesterday. The bottom line was the result was massive underreporting. Massive underreporting. We probably should be reporting in about 65% of the cases, but in reality, across our city, we wrote reports 29% of the time. That meant we had a huge problem. We had a state law, we had a department policy, great written policy, but our street policy was worlds apart from it. Well, we took the information to the chief and he said, okay, I want you to go out and train everybody. I want everybody to know that they're accountable for following the law here. We want to make sure that we respond to these victims. Yes, we want to stay liability free. And when it was time to put the training together, I have to tell you that I was the coordinator, okay? And I was warned against taking the job. I talked about this yesterday. I had people telling me, don't take this job. I mean, you're going to hate it. Now, I like a challenge, so I took the job. And I didn't really know about domestic violence. All I knew about was the way I responded to it as a young patrol cop. So guess where I had to go to get the training? Any guesses about where I went to get the training about domestic violence? Shelter workers, advocates, activists, the F word, feminists, who knew about the issue. They knew about this issue. They have known about it for 25 years. The problem was, we're first responders, police, and we didn't know. So I went to all of these people and learned. I read books, I watched videos, I sat in women's groups. I wasn't allowed to sit in a batterers group for the first 2 years. And I have to tell you an interesting story about that, because I did ask to sit in a batterers group. In fact, the facilitator, who had become a very strong friend of mine, went to this group and said, I've got a police sergeant who wants to come and hear what you guys have to say about your issues and why you got into this fix and why you're in counseling. And they said, yeah, great. And then she said, and her name is Sergeant Ann Odell. Boom, no way. Which gave her enough to talk about for the next 4 sessions, I understand. Anyway, the bottom line is we put together a training program in our department. We produced a 14-minute videotape, which we sent out to all law enforcement agencies in our county. but we had to go to the people who knew all about it. And as I started to put this training together, I had a saying on the wall of my office, and it's up here as a matter of fact, and I'll give it to you. You can come up and copy it later, because I really think it sums up what we had to do in this issue. And the saying is this: if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. And the problem was, what we had been doing was crap, and it got us nowhere. So we had to change it. I'm going to go through, and not in much detail, because a lot of this information is available in your folders, and also available if you call me later, I can send you specifics. But I'm going to go through the list of issues that we use on our department, starting with the academy training of our officers. And one thing I want you to know is, we don't just do this in the academy. We have refresher training, we train new sergeants, we have lineup training, because this is an issue that's so difficult to understand in terms of complexity that it needs to be an ongoing process of change within a law enforcement agency. The first thing that we did, and you heard Casey refer to this yesterday, is we started to think of it as a crime. And the way that we drove this point home in the academy was this way. We asked cops, how much time do you spend on DUI reports, driving under the influence of alcohol? And it varied, you know, some people an hour, some people 3 hours. By the time that you stop the person, conduct a field sobriety test, do the report, book them into jail, 3 hours. Why do you work so vigorously with this crime of driving under the influence? Well, because drunk drivers kill people. Oh, really? And how much time do you spend responding to domestic violence? Well, as little as possible, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, in and out. Do you know that domestic violence kills people? I think they got the point. We made it real for them. We used a lot of audio tapes of children calling 911, because police officers are very responsive to what happens to kids. We taught them about the big picture. We gave them the statistics. 80% of runaways are running away from abusive homes. These kids are 6 times more likely to commit suicide. These kids have a 74% greater chance of committing crimes against a person as an adult. And they're 24 times more likely to commit rape. So anybody who has a question about why there's so much violence in the world need only look in the homes that these kids come from, and there's your answer. We breed our criminals in their homes. We looked at the myths that we all have held for a long time about who does it. In fact, in order to really get the point across to police officers, I made placards in my department with news clippings of famous people who were batterers, who got convicted. People like O.J. Simpson. His news clipping from 1989 is something we've used for quite some time in our academy. And Jim Brown, by the way. You need to know that that's really shocking to young male recruits who look at sports figures as their heroes. They just can't believe it, but they do believe it after you let them read the clipping. And we use the examples of judges, police officers, lawyers, doctors, because we don't want them to think it's some group of people, some nebulous group of people, black, brown, poor, uneducated, that do that stuff. No, it happens everywhere. We taught them why this happens. Why do men batter? Because they can. And for a long time, nobody stepped in and said, you can't do this anymore. It's as simple as that. It's like kids. If you let kids do something for a long time and no one says it's wrong, they keep doing it, especially if it gets them what they want. We taught our cops how to interview victims and how not to interview victims. We don't want our cops standing over victims while they're sitting on a couch crying. We want them sitting down and looking at that victim eyeball to eyeball with some measure of compassion and empathy and a quest to find out what's really going on. We even told cops what semantics to use when they talk to victims. We told them never to ask, is this the first time this has happened? Because the reality is, it's never the first time it's happened by the time that we're involved. We ask the question, how many times has this happened before? We taught them about manipulation by batterers of police. And the first time we brought up the issue of manipulation, it was amazing. These police officers were sitting there saying, no way, we cannot be manipulated. Trust me, batterers have been able to manipulate cops for years. We didn't know any better. And the way that they do that is presenting different things. Batterers present as calm, cool, collected, the person who's really trying to hold family together, the real victim. I go out and work all day, da 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 da. And victims present as hysterical, screaming shrews. And the manipulation goes something like this. She's screaming, he's calm, he says to the cop, could you be married to her? And if you don't train your police officers to understand that and expect it and get past that, you're gonna have cops with the wool pulled right over their eyes. So we teach them about the fact that these guys are gonna try to manipulate them. We talk to them about the sophistication of batterers who for years into the abuse of their partner will hit in places where cops will not generally look, like beat their head against a wall. Unless you train your police officers to put on gloves and look under the hair for bumps, they're not gonna find them. They won't find the evidence they need to make an arrest. So we teach them that many of these people are very, very sophisticated in how they carry out their abuse. We train our police officers to recognize the difference between self-defense, mutual combat, and mutual violence. I've probably read and examined 100,000 domestic violence reports by this time, and I can tell you with all sincerity that mutual combat has probably happened less than 1% of the time. The problem with first responders of police is it's really difficult unless you train your cops how to detect what's going on to figure out who's primary aggressor and who's defending themselves. And in our jurisdiction, we don't want dual arrest. Dual arrest just means that the cop wasted all that money and all that time on a case that's going nowhere. So it's only in the rarest of times do we allow officers to make dual arrest. We also look at the issue of culture with regard to domestic violence in our city. We have had for a long time a large Hispanic population, and we now have different Indo-Chinese populations in our city, like Hmong, Laotian, Vietnamese, and Cambodian. So a police agency, I feel, has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to make sure that their information is available to people of different cultures. I mean, we simply can't say, well, they're here, and if I can't talk to them, well, I just give up. It's a very simple thing to print the written information available to domestic violence victims. Don't you have a mandate like that under your state code? They must furnish written information to victims of domestic violence. Am I correct? Okay. Just make sure, this is my recommendation, that that's available in the several different languages of the people who populate your area. We have it in 6 different languages. It's not a difficult thing to do. You just get it translated and make Xerox copies. The bottom line to all this training was that we did this training. We did the training over a period of 1 year, and the following year, our domestic violence reports increased 59% in the city of San Diego. And guess what? It wasn't because the DV grew. It was because we'd finally trained our police officers and we were also holding them accountable for following the law. Well, okay, that's one step. But if you look at it, a report, even with an arrest, is a bureaucratic process. It's a piece of paper. The next question for your agency is, what are you going to do with that piece of paper? What are you going to do that's really going to provide some meaningful intervention in the cycle of violence in this family? So we turned our attention on the department to the investigators. And if I thought I was discouraged looking at patrol officers and our inappropriate response to DV, I became even more depressed when I looked to the investigators. Most of the investigators on our department who had been handling domestic violence calls up to that point were what I term generalist type detectives, where they're given a stack of different cases to investigate. And unfortunately, most of them came from a time and place where we did the diffuse, mediate, and get out as quickly as possible kind of routine. So they didn't come from a background of knowing all about this issue. And to be fair, we really did try to train them. Some were more receptive than others. Most of them wanted these cases to go away. They didn't understand what was going on. They couldn't understand a victim's attitude, and they didn't know how to perceive what was going on, and they didn't know how to get beyond maybe the reluctance of the victim to talk to the investigator. They didn't know things like batterers unplug phones from homes and take them away. I didn't know it too, until about 1991, where I dealt with a victim who got abused routinely, and her husband would unplug the phone every day when he left for work and took it away, so she'd never get a call from the cops, no matter what. Believe me when I tell you, batterers do these things. They don't want the victim talking to anybody, but I'm talking to a detective who doesn't even understand that. He has no concept of this happening. They didn't understand that when a victim said they didn't want to testify in court, that didn't mean the victim didn't want it to stop. They didn't understand that. And they discouraged victims from following through with the prosecution of the case. We're very good in the police department, mine, and I'm sure it's the same anywhere, with either selling something or discouraging something. If I have to sell a ticket, I can sell it, okay? If I have to sell an arrest, I can sell it. But I also know how to dump stuff very, very neatly if I want to, and they were very good at dumping these cases so they didn't go anywhere. I need to tell you that wasn't all detectives, and I have a personal story about one of the detectives in my unit. I won't give you his name because I wouldn't violate his confidence that way, but we did have one detective, and we have 7 different area stations in San Diego. It's such a large city. And this officer worked in the eastern area of the city. And as I started to work in this issue, he would call me every once in a while and tell me about the cases, and also kind of give me information about the attitude of the people who worked around him. And I never understood how come this guy had gotten to be so evolved about the issue of DV. And it was because it was personal for him. It was personal. One of his sons, he's 50 years old, one of his sons was a batterer. Don't know how it happened. Steve is not a batterer, never has been, probably the furthest thing from a batterer. But he had to deal with this son, and it was so problematic for him, he made it his mission to do the right thing for these victims. Well, we started to look for ways to continue to improve on the police department, and we looked then very closely at investigations. And I started to take steps on my department to justify a specialized unit. And one of the big things I want to say here is, in my police department, 1,922 officers, big city, the same thing is possible in literally any jurisdiction in this country. If it's a small department, my suggestion is that the head of the agency consider selecting one person and giving them the responsibility to really become an expert on domestic violence. And if that person even devotes half of their workday to following up domestic violence cases, that's fine. But the point is, just because we did it in a large city doesn't mean it can't happen other places, across the country. It is possible. You just scale down the model. And you need to know that there was a lot of opposition on my department, okay? There were a lot of naysayers, and the naysayers said stuff like, well, we just don't have the resources. I mean, we don't have the money. Believe me, any problems that your area may have, we also have in San Diego. Not enough tax money, too much to do, not enough cops. And my response to anybody who says that now is, that's a bunch of BS, okay? A police department, a local law enforcement agency decides what will be their priority and what will not be their priority. And if you get the big picture and you're a believer in how this crime leads to all other crime that we deal with as a police officer, you finally get the message that until we start addressing the violence in the home, we'll never get a handle on juvenile delinquency, never get a handle on gangs or drugs or anything else. It isn't going to happen. We'll all stay employed. More of us will have to be hired to stay employed, but it's not a very proactive way of doing business. So we had the naysayers, but we also, at this point, had 59% more reports. And it was easy to sell, because all those detectives in the unit or across the department, which had been handling these reports, all of a sudden got a 60% increase in the number of cases they were investigating. And they went crazy. So we ended up justifying our unit and put it in place, and it has led to some really wonderful things. When I started putting this unit together, I have to tell you, I had this vision in my mind, and the vision said This is going to be a large office where victims come and they feel safe. And it's going to be in a police department. They're going to get help. They're not going to be blamed. They're not going to be judged. They're going to be assisted, and they're going to be made to feel safe. Let me see if I can draw a word picture for you. We have 19 detectives, 3 sergeants, and we also have a number of clerical people, and we also greatly use civilians in our unit. We're dealing last year with nearly 15,000 cases in the city of San Diego, and the bottom line is the police can't do it all by themselves. In our unit, we have a waiting room where we let victims sit with their children with all kinds of toys and little videos for kids to watch. And it's just, you know, it's my baby, and I walk around every day and I'm just amazed at what we've pulled off in a police department, because 19 years ago, this is a place that victims rarely turn to for help. We gave all of these detectives 4 days of training to make them the best specialists in the world in law enforcement. And 2 critical parts of the training for these detectives were these. One night we sent them to sit in front of 6 batterers. I finally got to hear batterers, but I had to have all these other guys around me before they let me in. So there were these 6 batterers, and another night we went and sat in front of 6 survivors, and we had these batterers and these survivors tell us up front what happened in their cases. The survivors told us about all the things that had happened that they didn't think were right, how stuff got swept under the rug and they didn't get help, and how we could better talk to them if our goal, all of us, was to really provide intervention, how we could do it together. And the batterers told these cops that they really didn't like doing what they do. And to be truthful, I don't believe that most batterers like what they do. They don't. They don't know any other way to deal with it, though. And if you don't teach them new ways, nothing changes. And they also told our cops how they'd fooled the police on all these prior cases. And they told about the prior victims they were involved with. Because if there's no intervention with the first partner, and she finally leaves, okay, then they go on to another person. That's why there are nationwide stats that say 1 out of every 2 women in the country will be hit at one time in their life. It's not because 1 out of every 2 guys is doing the hitting, but these guys are mobile. They go from victim to victim to victim. Anyway, the other part of the word picture I want to paint for you is that I've got propaganda up all over my office. People affectionately refer to it as Ann's propaganda. And I put it up on the wall, and I want to read off some of these things, and you're free to copy them down and make your own posters, because I think in our city, it could get really frustrating sometimes with so many cases and so many people needing help. And even the behavior of the victims sometimes is really distressing to us, even when we've been really trained a lot. I mean, there are days that you just think everybody beats everybody else up. So we put these posters up on the wall in our office, and I've got them in neon colors all over the office. The first one is a quote by Geraldine Staley, and I think you've got a packet of her information. She's very, very learned, very good speaker about the issue. She describes domestic violence as a crime against the future. The next one is a quote from Sarah Buell, who says, "We blame the victim because it's an easy way out. To do otherwise, we may have to take a hard look at how we do business." The third one is from Time magazine, and it says, "On women who kill their abusers, the best way to keep battered women out of jail is to keep them from being battered in the first place." The next one is a quote from Attorney General Janet Reno, "Domestic violence begets street violence." And the last one is another quote from Sarah Buell, who says, "Every time a victim says she's not willing to testify, it's her attempt to stay alive." In our office, we made a point from the very beginning to do some of the things that Lisa had put up on one of her overheads. In other words, we do not force our victims to do one thing or the other thing. We get paid to investigate the crime and do everything possible to send it up for prosecution. But our first goal in that unit is the safety of the victim. We don't get patriarchal, to use Casey's words, and insist that victims leave. We don't tell them they must divorce this man. We do make them aware of all the consequences, what will happen to their kids in terms of being traumatized and victimized by the abuse that's going on, and the fact that it doesn't stop even if he promises. We do all of that. But the bottom line is, it's her decision as to what she's going to do. If we start forcing victims or trying to force victims to do one thing or the other, we've just replaced the batterer. And that was something we had to work a lot on with people in our unit, because cops are by nature kind of controlling. I mean, we get paid to control stuff. So we had to learn that lesson very quickly of, this is how far you can go, and don't go any further because you're going to hurt her more than harm her. We're very proactive in the unit. We don't see ourselves as just a reactive police agency. We could, because basically police, we're reactive. I mean, we react when there's a problem. But we've become very proactive in this area because we think it benefits us as well as the community. And let me give you some examples. As I said earlier, we use volunteers on the police department. We came to the conclusion years ago, especially when funds were dwindling, that we could no longer have this attitude of we and them, okay? It's our society, it's our community. And I think cops for a long time have had this wall around what we do every day, and we say, we can't have any civilians in here. No, they wouldn't understand, they'll get in the way. We have 400 civilian volunteers at the San Diego Police Department. 12 to 15 of them work on a consistent basis in the domestic violence unit because we have too much work to do and we need their help. We've developed a questionnaire for our volunteers to use to call victims who have only been threatened and haven't been hit yet, because we want to stop it there if we can by education. And we send packets out to victims in our community. I would estimate that at least 50% of the 15,000 cases a year, these victims get a package of information about domestic violence. It costs us 29 cents to send the package out. And I can't tell you how effective it is because we don't know what we keep from happening. But in the packages, we put a resource list, the resource list that our cops give out when they're at the patrol scene. And then we also give them a paper that talks about the myths and facts of domestic violence, which is in your packet behind my name. And we also give them why women stay, so they'll recognize they're not alone and why they're staying. And we also give them signs of a battering personality, which has 17 red flags on it that will help a woman recognize whether or not she's becoming involved with a potential batterer. But that's the package we send out to our victims, and we send it out in different languages. So I don't know how effective it is. I just hope that someone somewhere is getting the message when they get this information. We believe very strongly in education, and you can well imagine that with 15,000 cases, we have a lot of work to do in the unit. Despite that, we've groomed about 8 of our detectives who really like public speaking to go out and create community awareness and community education around the issue of domestic violence. We go into colleges, we go into high schools, we go before Rotary, Lions clubs, those type of organizations. Now we're very effective and active in training the medical community as to their responsibility to report injuries of domestic violence. So we're not just reactive, we're very, very proactive in our work. The end result for this is, in the last 2 years in the city of San Diego, we have reduced the domestic violence homicide rate by 59%. What we were saying almost 5 years ago about intervention works, we've proven on our department. And believe me, 5 years ago, we had a lot of non-believers. We had people saying, this is BS, writing all this reports. Now cops come into our unit with a suspect in custody, and we pat them on the back, offer them coffee, say, you guys are doing such a great job. Did you see the article in the police paper about how you guys reduced homicide by 59%? So we give the credit to the whole department because that's where it goes. Although privately too, we have this little sign in the domestic violence unit that we call the homicide prevention unit. It works. Family, domestic violence, homicide is preventable in this country, and we're not the only city that's doing it. There are different countries across, different states across the country that do this. And I think there's information in Casey's material about the different places across America that are doing this. I have some recommendations for local agencies, and they are these. The first thing is I really encourage you, if you're a concerned citizen, to do everything you can to persuade your department to select a person who will become their domestic violence expert. And I'm not suggesting that that role be carried on 100% of the time. Perhaps in a really small agency it wouldn't be possible. But someone in your police department needs to learn about this issue. There needs to be a place where the buck stops. A resource, if you will, that cops can turn to about domestic violence. We are the first responder. We should know about this stuff. And if we can train cops how to run breathalyzers and how to detect the use of any kind of drug that you want to imagine, if we can train cops how to do field sobriety tests on drunk drivers, you can train cops about domestic violence. It can happen. They need to get books. They need to watch videos. They need to meet with the people who know about the issue. 5 years ago, we didn't have a lot of cooperation with the shelter people. Now we have a very close partnership. Shelter workers, advocates come on ride-alongs with us so they can see what we're up against. And we go, as a part of the police training in the academy, they go and work for 1 or 2 days with a shelter person. So it's a partnership. I mean, the bottom line is cops can't do it all, shelter workers can't do it all, and we ought to stop pointing fingers at each other and saying bad stuff. We have to admit this is our problem and we have to get together and work on it together. I wanted to give you some numbers of resources before I leave. The first thing that you should be aware of is next month in Orlando, Florida, there's a conference about domestic violence. It may be too late, I hope it isn't, for your sake. And you should really think about attending this conference or getting someone, your local law enforcement agency, to be able to attend it. It is the 4th annual National Conference on Domestic Violence. It is sponsored by the National College of District Attorneys, and both Casey and I have spoken at this conference. It will be held between October 16th and October 19th. And one thing I wanted to point out is the hotel where it's being held is right next to Walt Disney World, Epcot Center, and MGM Studios. And it's just a short drive away from Universal Studios, SeaWorld, Busch Gardens, and the Kennedy Space Center. Any way you can get them there, I say. The number to call for information is area code 713-743-1844. I'll repeat it. Area code 713-743-1844. That's for information about the 4th annual conference sponsored by the National College of District Attorneys. The other 2 numbers I wanted to give you are these. These are both 800 numbers, and they can provide you with a lot of resource information about domestic violence. The first one is the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, and it's in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and the phone number is 1-800-537-2238. The next one is the Health Resource Center on Domestic Violence, which is based in San Francisco, and the phone number is 1-800-313-1310. The last number I want to give you is my number. I have a lot of written information, training materials on how to train police officers, and I also have a lot of material on building a coordinated community response, and my phone number is 619-531-2490. That's 619-531-2490. I want to end with telling you a story, which I call Howard's story. If Howard could only hear me now. Howard is Howard Labor. If Casey were still in the room, he'd know what I was talking about. He's one of the 19 detectives in my unit, and I want to describe this guy to you. He's the last person in the world you would think would be very evolved and sensitive and compassionate, because he's like 6'2". He looks like a big old grizzly bear. I mean, he's really a big guy. Kind of lumbers along. He's an excellent detective, though. And I'm going to tell you a story about one of the cases that he had and how he handled it, so you understand why I think so much of this detective named Howard Labor, who I wish all of you could have a Howard Labor in your area, because he's really a prize. He got a case in October of 1993, and the two people involved were called Nancy and Wes. Now, Nancy was 5'5" and weighed 150 pounds. Wes was 5 foot 10 inches tall and weighed 250 pounds, so he outweighed Nancy by 100 pounds. The two of them met in January of 1993, and a short time after they met, they started a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, as we all start boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, you know? You like the person, there's really nothing bad about them, you really get along with them well, there's that attraction thing. Now, the reality was that Wes had a drinking problem. In fact, he was on occasion going to substance abuse meetings. Nancy had had a drinking problem years ago, but she had been sober for many, many years. She was a helping kind of a person, and she met and fell in love with Wes. Well, they dated from January to October, and there were probably 6 to 10 physical abuse situations that happened, with Wes being the abuser and Nancy being the victim. And finally, there was a week that happened in October of 1993, which is something I describe as a cluster. If anything could go wrong, it went wrong. By the time that this week had arrived, Nancy had finally made a decision that no more was she going to stay with this guy, because the problem was, get away, fly, every time he drank, he beat her up. And as Lisa pointed out, alcohol doesn't cause domestic violence, but it certainly does exacerbate injuries, and it gives batterers a license and excuse to be violent with their partner. Well, the first incident happened on the 21st of 1993, October. And she had made a break with Wes and said, don't come back over here. It was her house. She lived with 2 other people. And he came despite that. He got drunk, came over, banged on the door, tried to get in, broke a window, trying to get at her, yelled and screamed at her that he was going to kill her. Well, she was really afraid, and she called the police. Police responded. A younger officer did put all the facts down, wrote a really good report, and found this guy and arrested him for drunk in public, although he included in it the misdemeanor charge of vandalism and also the threats to kill. If it had been a little more experienced, he probably would have stretched it a bit and taken the guy to jail for a felony, which is threatening to kill. He didn't do that. He went to jail for drunk. He didn't stay very long. He gets out and gets in a car accident, drunk, right? Now, this guy's on parole for other violent behavior unrelated to the two of them. Well, Nancy finds out about it and tells his parole officer, okay? So the parole officer knows now. And you heard Casey mention yesterday that's still a little problem area for us, getting parole officers in line with what's got to happen here. Told the parole officer about the violence and all this other stuff. Well, the parole officer finally found him, but instead of putting him in jail, he went ahead and he put him in a rehabilitation home, okay? Well, the guy walked away 4 hours later. Well, about 3 or 4 days went by, and there were other incidents where he came over and caused a ruckus, and she made him leave, and the roommates helped her make him leave. Finally, about a week after the first incident, he comes over and forces his way into the home. And this time, he really, really lets her have it. I mean, he starts punching her in the back of the head. Her 2 roommates were in another bedroom. Starts punching her in the back of the head, right in the back of the neck. And she's walking away saying, you gotta get out, you gotta get out. Now, she's 150 pounds. I mean, realistically, how easily can she make him get out? She tries to go for the phone, and he rips the phone and breaks it, okay? She finally sits down on the couch, and she's so frustrated and stressed out at that point, she just starts crying. And he comes over to her, and he's punching her on the back of the head. She's got her back to him, and then he puts his hands around her neck. Now remember, this is a guy a week ago who told her he was gonna kill her, and he starts saying that again. I'm gonna kill you, bitch, and starts strangling her. So she reaches out, and there's a steak knife there, and she picks it up. Now understand, she's got her back to him. And all she can do is go over her right shoulder, and she gets him right on the side of the neck. Tiny little 2-centimeter laceration, barely anything. Well, he doesn't stop. He continues to choke her. So she takes the knife again and goes under her arm and gets him in the back. And that's 4 centimeters longer, and he can feel it. So he lets go of her and starts screaming bloody murder about she stabbed him and goes out front. Well, the police get called, and the police get there, and they're really confused because this guy has been stabbed in the back. Now, I have trained them that you look for scratches on the front of the face, bite marks under the arm to indicate a arm lock or headlock. I've taught them about looking for bite marks on the stomach and the chest, which would indicate it's a self-defense type of thing, but I've not talked a lot about being stabbed in the back. And this cop is really very shaky here. He doesn't know. He's thinking, wait a second, who do I believe here? To his credit, and he's been on about 23 years, I know him personally, he didn't want to make the wrong move, so he called the domestic violence unit, and we have an on-call detective. This happened at 9:30 at night. We're open 7 days a week because DV happens on the weekend, so why would you close on the weekend? But we're not open all night long. We dispatched one of our DV detectives, and it was Howard Labor. And Howard got there, and Howard heard the story. The guy was at the hospital being stitched up. He started examining how it could have happened, had the cop do a diagram, got all the facts, talked to the 2 roommates who did see them sitting in that position with her in front of him and him beating her on the back of the head. So substantiated that Nancy's story was true. And then he went to the hospital, and of course Wes was just so forgiving. He didn't want anything to happen to Nancy. I mean, oh no, I don't want to press charges against her. Right, we know you don't. What Howard ended up doing, of course, is the cop had detained Nancy for the detective to get there, and once Howard determined that this was self-defense and there was nothing else this woman could have done, he released her. And a day later, Wes got out of jail and he was booked. Got out of the hospital and he was booked into jail for 3 different violations of the penal code. I think he was very surprised. That's how effective our intervention can be in our city. So my wish for all of you at this conference is to use the information you've gotten as inspiration to consider all the things that you can do in your area. I may not be able to give you a Howard Labor, but I can give you my wish for what you do in the future. Thank you. I like to get an idea of who's in my audience because it helps me direct my speech or my lecture a little better. So how many people are from law enforcement? Okay, are most of you in the patrol aspect or the investigations aspect or the administrative aspect? How many are chiefs or heads of agencies? Okay, how many are investigators? And how many are patrol people? Okay, and then who are the other people? Do we have advocates in the room? Okay, any prosecutors? Anybody else that I forgot to ask about?
Victims.
Victims, okay.
Mental health.
Mental health? Okay. I want to start by giving you a little bit of an overview about my department and how San Diego is set up. My city, of course, is not really comparable to Missoula, shall we say. We have a population of 1.3 million people. But one of the things I want you to keep in mind is when I start talking about how to train cops, how to do it right, and how to make sure that we prepare cases that go forward for prosecution so we can do something effective, that there's really little difference, if any, in the way that we do that, whether you're from a big city or a very small jurisdiction. The way it works in San Diego is we have 4 specialized units. We're very fortunate. Not a lot of cities have specialization to the extent that we do in San Diego. Not only do we have a follow-up detective or investigations unit in my police department, but you'll be hearing from Casey Gwynn in the afternoon. He has the city attorney's specialized domestic violence prosecutions unit. In addition to that, we have a district attorney who also has a specialized unit of prosecutors. And the last area of specialization in the city and the county is the probation department. And I have to admit to you that the police department that I work for was the last to come on board. There was a lot of pressure put on us to provide a much better response to victims of domestic violence. And so we finally started changing things in 1990. I'm going to show you a little bit of a video, and what this is just a news story that was done on one of our major affiliates in San Diego about our specialized unit and why it's so effective. And I show it to you because it's hard to paint a word picture, if you will. So if you can see about 6 or 7 minutes of some of the detectives and some of the things that we do, you'll get an idea of what perspective I'm coming from. However, I know that the reality is, in a small jurisdiction, for me to come here and say you should all get in specialized units is really not very feasible. What I will tell you is, where we've got a unit of 25 people, my recommendation to any agency which is in the business of serving and protecting is they should find one person to make their specialist, one person who knows about the issue. I've been a cop for 19 years. This is an area we haven't looked very strongly at. Before I show you the video, just let me tell you the end of the story before I go any further. In 1990, we really started to change the way we dealt with domestic violence in our city. In 1986 in California, that's the first year we had real strong laws put on the books regarding domestic violence, and also strong mandates to all law enforcement agencies about what they were supposed to do if they were going to do it right and provide effective intervention, not just respond to the same house every Friday night for the next 15 years. So in 1990, we started changing our training. When we look at the numbers that year in the city of San Diego, we had 18 domestic violence homicides, okay? That was, even at that point, a little under the national average. We also wrote 7,373 reports for a city of 1.3 million people. Not a lot of reports. When you know that 1 out of 4 relationships generally has domestic violence occurring in it. Some studies say 16% of the population, some studies say 1 out of 4. Now, we instituted the training that I'll be sharing with you today, and in 1991, our homicide rate for that year for domestic violence, this is just domestic violence homicides, went up to 22. But look what happened to our reports, just based on 1 year's worth of training. They increased almost 60% in the city. And it wasn't because domestic violence grew by 60%. What had happened was we had really aggressively trained our police officers to both recognize domestic violence and report it on paper. But a report is what? A report is not that significant. It is a bureaucratic step, okay? One of our biggest goals was to reduce the number of domestic violence homicides. The following year, in 1992, we finally had created the unit that I head up, which is specialized investigators, to take that bureaucratic piece of paper one step further. And the result that year was a massive reduction in the number of domestic violence homicides in that 1 year. We went from 22 to 8 the following year, which is very, very small number of domestic violence homicides for the 6th largest city in the United States. Very small. Look around, trust me, it's very low. That year our reports continued to rise, which is the phenomenon. It's the thing that will happen when you start taking this seriously is your reports go up, and what does that say about your police department? It says you have cops who are trained, their victims in the community are not afraid to call the cops for help because they know they're going to get good service. So the reports continue to go up. In 1993 we had 10 homicides, and our reports still continue to increase, but not as much. This year so far we've had 6 homicides. And every time there's a homicide, everybody in my unit opens up the paper and they just feel this personal sense of failure that we lost another one. And we try to get beyond that. And one of the things that we do, which is I think critical for law enforcement to do, is we look at every case of homicide or aggravated assault and we go back in time to the first contact that family had with our police department, and we look at every step that happened and we ask ourselves, did we do it right? Did we follow our protocol? Did we screw up? How did we screw up, and how can we do it better? If you don't do that kind of inspection process on what you're doing in domestic violence, you're not going to be effective and you won't learn. Okay, I want to play just a little bit of this video because I like videos and it's educational. If I can make it work right.
We are still waiting.
look at your mate. Does he get a little jealous? Is he a little overprotective? Are there problems in your relationship that are always your fault? Those are 3 signs you might be living with a potential abuser. Those are signs a special unit of the San Diego Police Department used to spot lethal wedlock.
Princess, you looked at me?
Yes, coming to the door now. Did either one of you call and say send the police or? A typical night for cops who work the night shift all over San Diego. The majority of what we get, or a good portion of what we get, are domestic violence related. Answering calls
He's threatening her to kill her. He got a knife.
from domestic violence victims whose cycle of abuse is just beginning. You guys aren't really providing us with any kind of real information that makes us confident. Or has spiraled out of control.
I tried to come in the middle so he wouldn't do it, and then her baby was contained.
And at that time, in your mind, did you feel like he was trying to stab her with the knife?
Seeing the faces of children
She was scared though.
caught in the middle.
You look at them as if they're prisoners of war, and they really are. If you could hear some of the 911 calls,
And he had the knife, he came around this way. Yeah, he cut her with his knife.
On December 8th of last year, one child was literally caught in the middle. Little Eric Sanders was killed, along with his mother, both murdered by her new husband. In the last 4 years, nearly 60 people were murdered by a spouse or a partner. As bad as that sounds, it's not nearly as bad as it used to be.
I think in the past the cops were the same as the rest of society. We wanted to get rid of the problem by blaming the woman for not leaving, which is really kind of an idiotic thing to do when you know that 70% of the women who are killed in domestic violence have left or are in the process of leaving.
4 years ago, the police department started to take a different approach.
3890 total cases for the first quarter of the year, and 2 homicides, which is 1 less than last year at this time.
The biggest step we took at the police department here is that in 1992 we created this brand new unit that we're sitting in. It's the first of its kind for major law enforcement.
They always feel really bad when the police are there.
Sergeant Ann O'Dell is one of 3 sergeants in the unit, and the force behind getting it started in 1990.
She walked with you then, right?
There are 19 full-time detectives here.
We got 9 cases in one day.
One of his friends, I guess, got tired of seeing her abuse and helped her to escape.
When Sergeant O'Dell and her unit hit the streets in 1990, there were barely 7,000 domestic violence reports, but 18 domestic violence homicides. Last year, domestic violence reports had doubled, but there were half as many homicides.
Because the officers were better trained, they started writing reports. They started writing a whole lot more reports, some 59% increase in 1 year. And as the reports went up, we saw something else interesting happening, and that is homicides started to decrease. In fact, in the last 2 years, we've decreased domestic violence homicide by 59%.
And it's not just members of the special unit watching out for domestic violence, it's every cop on the street.
Our policy is that when we come across a case like that with a visible injury, where we have the proper type of relationship, we will make the arrest.
What if she says no, don't do it?
It doesn't matter. The state is prosecuting. She isn't.
They're very aggressive in making arrests. Our officers arrest between 375 and 400 people a month, because we told them that that first part of the process, the immediate arrest, is one of the most important things they can do to deter violence.
How bad did the abuse get? Very bad. To the point of, I almost killed her.
It took an arrest for John to get help.
I knew it before, but not as much. It didn't come home until I pulled the trigger twice. And that's when I knew I could have killed this person.
Bill was a batterer too.
I kept trying to force an answer out of her, which made the situation worse, and didn't answer until the point that we even got into a situation where it got violent and abusive with her. At that point, she called the police, and they showed up and took me to jail.
But jail isn't always a cure.
Wow.
Amy's boyfriend went to jail for beating her up.
So you went to jail for how long?
Almost a year.
Well, a year. So then you're finished with this guy, right?
No. I saw him again. I thought he changed.
John had his wife convinced he changed too.
Baby, I love you. Just coming back. It's not going to happen again. It was an accident. Or I just lost it. You know how my temper is. And if you didn't say this, I wouldn't have done that. I'm not going to do it again. I promise. I'm not going to do it again.
Just a little sample, John says, of how he used to convince his wife to take him back. Detectives in the domestic violence unit say it's sometimes something most batters are good at, and that's why the best police work, the best court system, all the intervention in the world often isn't enough to stop abuse. Tomorrow, we're going to give you one of the best weapons you can use.
My editing efforts leave a lot to be desired. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is you should be aware of what your police agency in your jurisdiction is doing and what the numbers are. I've been talking to a few people since I got here on Saturday night and asked questions about, how many homicides do you have, how many police reports, and amazingly, the information is really sketchy. And what I want you all to know is, even if you work for a police department, you should know what number of reports you're dealing with. If you're a concerned citizen, you should know what those numbers are. Every law enforcement agency in the country is required to submit information, case numbers, and what type of crime we're talking about to the Department of Justice, okay? So that information is available. And if you're looking at how responsive your agency is to domestic violence, that's the first place to look. That's what we did in San Diego. In 1990, what happened was my chief at that time was concerned that we were not doing the right thing for victims of domestic violence, okay? What he did was he created a brand new position on the police department, and he called it Domestic Violence Coordinator. In your literature, it says something about Family Violence Coordinator, but it's all in the same, really, except in California, domestic violence is specific to people who have been in or currently in intimate relationships. Now, let me just check. In Montana, family violence can also include violence that occurs for children, right? Or is that called child abuse? Okay. But it's all family violence. Okay. What happened was when he created this position, and I was fortunate enough to get the job, and I must tell you that after being on the department at that point for 15 years, I probably had 25 officers come up to me and say, "Don't take that job. It's going to be horrible. You're going to hate it. It's going to be terrible. You can't deal with this." And I just kind of ignored them and said, "It sounds interesting. It sounds like a challenge." A couple years later, when I was on Zantac for an ulcer, I probably questioned my decision, but I did it anyway. Anyway, what the chief said to me at the time was, "I want you to look at what we're doing, and I don't want you to just look at the reports, because that won't tell you how good your police department is. The thing that will tell you how good your police department is not looking at written reports, because all that tells you is that you had a cop who went out, recognized there was DV, and wrote a report, right?" He said, "I want you to look at all our responses." So I started doing some research, and the first place that I went to was the communications division. Now, I've already checked, and most of your police departments, if not all, have computer-aided dispatch, correct? They're all on a computer system. It is possible to go into that and do research to compile the numbers of times that your officers go to what we call a family beef, a family dispute, right? Okay, so I did that. I looked at it, and now understand, with 15 years on, I was really proud of San Diego PD. I said, we're really progressive, we're cutting edge technology and everything. Well, I looked at all these calls for a certain period of time, and it took a long time, but I went through it. And I found out that 65% of the time when our officers had responded to family beefs, they should have, under our state mandate, written a report. Guess what percentage of time they wrote a report? Any guesses?
10%.
We were a little better. 29% of the time versus 65% of the time. What'd that tell me? We were dropping the ball. We were dropping the ball. We had this state mandate, and then we had this department policy, good written policies. Problem with it, it wasn't the real world. We weren't doing it. Now, again, being a cop for a long time, I knew that if I went back to the chief and I told the chief that all the naysayers and the non-believers and the people who insist on staying in the dark ages would say, "Yeah, but RPs lie when they call communications." So I figured, well, I've got to bolster this. So the second thing I did was I conducted my own anonymous poll of police officers in San Diego. Now understand, in San Diego, we have 1,922 police officers. That's a large department when you're trying to make an attitudinal change and a behavior change about domestic violence. Well, what I did was I selected 100 officers on the department, and I selected 12% female and the remaining 88, not very good at math, 88% male, because that did reflect the gender proportions for officers on our department. And they all had to work patrol, and they went from 1 to 20 years tenure in patrol, okay? And I put together this questionnaire that asks questions like, well, if you respond to the call and they don't want to report, do you write one anyway? If she says that he slapped her and you can't see anything, do you tell her she has a right to make a citizen's arrest? Because that's under our state law. They have to do that. And it was amazing. I mean, all the information I got from this anonymous poll substantiated what I'd already learned in the communications study. So, I mean, the fact was RPs didn't lie, not about DV anyway. The third thing that I did was I went to social service agencies in our community. We have about 4 or 5 social service agencies that either operate a hotline or operate a shelter or a safe house, and they have services for battered women and their children. And I figured, well, if you want to know how good a job we're doing, it's like any other business. You know, cops, we're public servants. We work for the community. We work for the public. And if you want to know how good a job you're doing, then you go to the customers. You are paid to serve and protect and provide service for. So I went there and I wanted to find out, what are our cops doing right? What are our cops doing wrong? And you can't believe what I heard. I mean, I just got so much information that really held a critical part in how I developed the training from then on. The first realization that I came to is cops don't know about DV. We don't. We are not the experts. There are experts in this area that have been experts for 30 years. Generally, we call them feminists, advocates, activists, and when they come into the police academies, we all hiss and boo behind their backs. But you know what, folks? They know about domestic violence, and we need to learn from them. We don't know about this issue. You know what we know about? And I am a very blunt person, so I don't mean to offend anybody, but we know about trying to make the problem go away. For years, we have gone in and gotten out as quickly as possible. For years, we have diffused and mediated, and we had this perception that with our badge and our gun and our uniform, we could shake our fist in the face of the batterer and say, I don't want you to do this or I'm going to come back, as if it would have any impact on him. Guess what? They don't care. And when we leave, they come back, and now she gets it twice as bad. So we weren't doing it right. We were doing it terribly, terribly. Okay, so I put all this information together, and I took it to the chief, and I said, Chief, this is where we stand. We have this wonderful written policy, great department policy, great mandates, but I'm going to tell you, this is the real world. This is what our cops are doing. We're not doing a very good job, and yes, we are at risk for liability. And I just want to make one comment about liability. It's interesting. As a cop, I've been sued already 4 times in my career, 19 years. And when we get sued as cops, we generally, almost without exception, get sued for overreaction. False arrest, police brutality, something kind of like that. Now, this new crop of lawsuits that's kind of springing up regarding domestic violence are always for underreaction. It's for what the cops didn't do. Okay, and that's the thing that we have to keep in mind. Anyway, he said, okay, I want you to go out and train all of our police officers, and I also want you to train the dispatchers, and please don't overlook the dispatchers in your agencies, because they're the first person that a victim or a neighbor will come in contact with. I don't know about Montana. I do know that in California we have very strong, strict guidelines for communications personnel. They must dispatch domestic violence calls where the suspect is present, and they must be among the highest priority of calls that are dispatched. So it was critical for us to start there, so we started there. And then we trained all levels of the police department in this new way of training about domestic violence. Now mind you, we did have training in 1986. We had it. We had mandated 8 hours of training in 1986. But I have to tell you that the way that it was delivered was in an apologetic fashion. They might as well have said, "Ah, shucks, guys, it's the law. We don't like it, but we've got to follow it." And that's truly how it came across. Well, in 1990, we really did change that. The first thing that you have to do is make your officers understand this is a crime. It is a crime. It doesn't matter if it's his girlfriend or his wife or a person he had a baby with at one time. It's a crime. The only exception for someone being able to hit somebody else and not have it be a crime is when it's self-defense, which we'll discuss a little later. But it may seem like a simplistic statement. It is not a simplistic statement. If you understand a little bit of what you heard this morning about the fact that this is an activity that has been condoned for decades and centuries in religious and civil law, the right and authority that a man has to physically control his wife, and if you're speaking to a law enforcement agency comprised mainly of men who generally or a few times are on the receiving end of it, it's a lot harder attitudinal change to get across. But it can happen. It's happened in my agency as well as a number of other agencies across the country. Okay, so we started to put together this training, and the first thing we acknowledged is it's a crime. No, it doesn't matter if she called you a wimp. Doesn't matter if she told you you're really lousy in bed. It doesn't matter if she referred to your shortness as being something that's really terrible and said you have a short man's complex. None of these things say it's okay to smack her. We don't believe in button pushing. We don't buy that excuse. We don't buy the manipulation because we're prepared for it. We know it's going to happen. So you need to look at it like a crime. And it's really funny because when we first started training cops, they'd say, well, look at her. And you know, we don't care. This is the law. And this is fair, okay? If it's that bad, he should leave, okay? Once he crosses the line and gets physical, smacks her, pushes her, chokes her, won't let her out of his grasp, now he has to own those actions. We don't care. We don't care, okay? We don't allow button pushing to be an excuse for it's okay to batter somebody. The next thing we started to do was to try to make it real for police officers. Now, I know you're going to say, well, they already know how real it is. They do. We know how real it is when we see blood, guts, and gore, okay? That's the only time we know it's real. We don't know that most of the time batterers are so sophisticated they can hit in places and with such force that you'll never see the injuries unless you look under clothes and look under hair and things like that. So one of the ways that we got across to our cops was we started making them very aware of the impact of domestic violence on children. Because cops have a thing about children. When children are involved, all of a sudden it's a different issue. I want to play a tape for you. This is just one of the examples of the tapes we use in training. And we use it in the academy and all of our training. Can you hear it?
12 hours. This is a 911 telephone call to call Tigger position CT
Should have a microphone.
San Diego Police Emergency. So, my address is 378 Bar Boulevard, apartment 55. My dad came and started stuff with my mom because my mom's friend, husband, worked on the car, and he got mad. So what did your dad do? He came with his friend, started to do stuff, and he told the guy to leave, and he left right now, and he was gonna hurt my mom. How did he hurt your mom? She had the back. She wasn't gonna hit him. She was just gonna scare him to go away. And he grabbed her and like kind of twisted her arm, and I got scared. And so in his leap, and I got mad and I kicked the car, and he pulled over, and that's when he hurt my mom's arm. And I was just scared because what's going on right now?
We use these all the time because we want cops to understand that when they respond to that family beef, that they have to understand how traumatized these kids are. And what was going on here? This is a guy estranged from his wife who comes over and sees another guy in the front yard in a car and gets ticked off at her, and during the altercation she picks up a bat to protect herself, and he comes up and twists her arm behind her back. No blood, no guts, no gore, no knife, no gun. And listen to this kid. He's 11 years old. He's traumatized, very traumatized. These kids live in what Mark Wynn from Nashville, Tennessee calls domestic terrorism. If you ever have the opportunity to listen to Mark Wynn, I really recommend that you do that. He's a police sergeant in Nashville, Tennessee. He's just now started a domestic violence unit. He grew up in this kind of a household. His stepfather was a drunkard and a batterer and used to routinely beat his mother. And he talks about trying with his little younger brother, trying to poison this guy. That's how to the end of his rope he was as a child. And he said that when the cops came, it was almost like, you know, the cavalry coming, the good guys on their horses with their white hats. He was always so relieved when they took the stepfather away for, at that time, just drunk behavior rather than domestic violence. But this is a man certainly who got over that tendency for young boys who grew up in that situation to develop that learned behavior as an adult, and he did exactly the opposite. Became a police officer, became very engrossed in domestic violence issues, and now heads up a DV unit in Nashville, Tennessee. So he can speak very eloquently on it. Okay, going back to making the issue real, we use audio tapes, 911 calls. 1/3 of all our 911 calls in San Diego are from children, okay? And so we have a lot to pick from to make the issue real to whoever we're trying to teach. The other thing we do is we use a lot of videotapes. And I want to give you some names of some that you might, think about getting if you're deciding to maybe update your training on domestic violence. There's one called Defending Our Lives. You probably will see a portion of that a little later on, either today or tomorrow. There's two versions. One is 30 minutes and one is 40 minutes long, and it's excellent. There's also one put out by MTI. Anybody who wants to can just call me later at my phone number at work, and I can give you an address. I don't have it with me. There's another one called Turning Point, and you may want to ask Lisa Grisham. She's going to speak later. She's told me that has just been produced, and it's really very, very effective in training anybody in the issue of domestic violence. We used panels of survivors and batterers to train our cops in San Diego. We've only used them a couple times in the academy, and we've always used panels of batterers and survivors to train our police detectives. And I can't tell you what an impact that these panels made on cops. I mean, to go in a room and sit with 6 women who have been routinely beaten up and had police respond, and sometimes have the response good and sometimes have it bad, is very eye-opening for police officers to hear the perspective from the victim. And even more critical was sitting them in front of a panel of 6 men who are batterers, who are currently in counseling, who would sit there and express thanks, most of them, for being arrested, and talk about the numerous times that they had done the same thing to this girlfriend or wife or former wives or girlfriends and gotten away with it, and how they did it when the cops came, how they manipulated the police officers. When we talk about manipulation of batterers or police by batterers in the academy, the first time it was presented, I mean, these cops looked at me like, wait, we're too smart. No, we aren't. Not with domestic violence, we are not too smart. These guys have been manipulating both their victims and society for decades, and they certainly know how to manipulate police. No longer very successfully in San Diego. Okay, we explain to police officers about the big picture. A lot of cops are like a lot of people. We want to think this is just a family squabble. I mean, it's just the relationship. I mean, if he wasn't with her, he wouldn't do this. Because they don't understand that batterers do this from victim to victim, and it goes on without intervention. And they want to think that it's almost always mutual combat. It isn't. I would suspect, and I've looked at probably 100,000 cases by now, I would suspect that probably less than 1% of cases are truly mutual combat. Okay, but if you're a police officer and you're running from call to call and you want to dispense with the problem quickly, it's a lot easier sometimes to just take them both to jail. It's not right, but it certainly does solve the problem for that night. Okay. We share with police officers in our area the reality about how this crime begets all other kinds of crime. Janet Reno says it. She says domestic violence begets street violence. And she's absolutely correct. This is not something that just happens with him and her. It affects everybody. Children who come from these homes are 74% more likely to commit crimes against the person as adults. They are 24 times more likely to commit rape. They are 6 times more likely to kill themselves. And in our jurisdiction, 80% of our runaways are running away from child abuse or domestic violence or a combination of both. So how dare any of us say this is a squabble between both of them, because it isn't true. It affects everybody. And it affects the rest of us as we pay out for medical costs, as we pay out for legal costs, as we pay out for law enforcement costs. So we need to look at the big picture. One of the other things that's an interesting bit of trivia on domestic violence is it's very closely correlated with child abuse. We know that in our area that 50% of the time we've got both issues going on in the same house. And that's why in our department, our domestic violence unit, we're right across the hall from the child abuse unit. And very oftentimes we will work together on a case where the information comes in and we have a crime which involve both child endangerment and domestic violence. So we talk about the big picture. We do a lot of myth breaking in San Diego. When we first started training at the academy, I was relating how when I was in patrol, I had this idea because I worked almost an entirely black area of the city, a little like Watson, LA. I really believed, and so did all my coworkers do, that really the only people who do this are black, brown, poor, and uneducated. We really believe that. I mean, we have this myth that it's just them. It's them. You know why? Because it's easy to point a finger at a group of people and say it's them. Well, you know what? It's us. Okay, it's all of us. You could be sitting right now next to a victim or next to a batterer and you won't know. They don't have B's in their forehead, they don't have B's on their forehead. And they come from all walks of life. And the way that we train cops in the academy is we went and got these news clippings. And the interesting thing is, one of the news clippings we started using 4 years ago was of, guess who? O.J. Simpson, 1989 conviction for domestic violence. And the second one on the same placard is Jim Brown, who's also a batterer. But we wanted, especially these young impressionable cops in the academy, to understand that their sports heroes do this. They have money, they have prestige, they certainly have everything a lot of people could want, and yet they're still batterers. Well, what's the problem here? We also have in our placards a news clipping that talks about a case against a judge, and perhaps Casey will refer to him later in the day. One that is a police officer where tragically in our own department we dropped the ball. This was an officer who worked our DARE program. Nice guy, everybody liked him. 2 prior reports of domestic violence before this program in 1990 started up and got running. So we weren't really applying the law the way that we should have. And 2 reported domestic violence incidents, and finally he killed her as she returned home from graduation at the Sheriff's Academy. And we really did drop the ball. Now we have in our department a very strong policy of dealing with our own when they are suspects. We don't have 2 standards in San Diego. That was a tragic way to learn that we had to hold both cops who were batterers and the public who were batterers to the same standard. So we believe that myth. And the other ones were things like a lawyer. We have the head of Nussbaum, the guy, what was his first name? Joel, thank you. Joel Nussbaum story. We have the John Fetters news clipping. This was a guy who was in Washington, a politician in charge of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the point we try to make is, we don't want our cops to be manipulated or fooled when they come across a batterer who maybe is professional, charismatic, smooth talking, and seems like he's got it all together, because I'll tell you, one thing about batterers, they always have 2 faces. They have this public face and they have this private face. Okay? And we don't want our cops to be fooled, so we break that myth. We also break the myth, and I did talk to somebody earlier about this, but we break this myth that domestic violence is the most dangerous call for police. It is not. Now, I don't want to stand here and suggest that we should not use the safety practices that we all learned in a police academy. I'm not saying that at all. We always respond to our calls safely using all the tactics and techniques we learned in the police academy. But the reality is that domestic violence calls are not the most dangerous calls for the police. They have never been that way. What happened a few years ago was the Department of Justice lumped all disturbances together, okay? It included bar fights, it included gang fights, fights in the street, and domestic violence. And somehow, throughout the years, that #1 reason for cops getting killed and injured kind of turned around to just be domestic violence. And my personal perception about it is, we don't like these calls. We've never liked these calls. They're too close to home for us. We've all been in a relationship with a member of the opposite sex that we weren't really happy about it, and we make the mistake of confusing our personal history with what we're responding to in the field, and that makes us uncomfortable. So we have to have an appropriate answer for why we as a police officer wouldn't like these calls, right? So it's because it's the most dangerous, and every time you get there, she jumps on your back. That's That's not true. I worked patrol for 7.5 years in a very busy area. I probably had one time had a woman jump on my back. I mean, it must be a very different area if somebody else has had it happen 50 times. I just don't believe it. But it is a myth. Is this too blunt for you? Very straightforward. The cops in my department will tell you we cut no slack with respect to our behavior in this. Okay, now I want to talk to you about working with victims. Once our cop gets there, and we separate the parties, which we always do, we interview them separately, we keep both of them in positions so that they cannot talk or view each other. It's really critical that your officers do this. If the batterer is allowed to maintain eye contact with the victim, she won't give anything up to the cops. I mean, our prosecutors know this, so when the case goes to court and she's up on the stand, they stand right in front of the batterer so he can't make eye contact. Because batterers have the ability to merely raise an eyebrow and send a strong message of intimidation. So don't make the mistake of allowing the two to have any contact at the scene, because you're not going to get the information you need to do your job correctly. When it's time to sit down and talk to your victim, do it in an enlightened fashion. We tell our cops, don't stand next to victims who are sitting on the couch with your gun side to her, or, stand over her. That's the last thing she needs when she's just been beat up by a guy in her life. If you want to get the facts and the information from her to do the job correctly, sit down and look at her eyeball to eyeball. Treat her as you would a rape victim. Most police departments train their cops to deal with rape victims in a very sensitive, enlightened fashion. The reality is that your domestic violence victim, there's a high likelihood that she also has been raped, although it may probably not come out at the time of the initial patrol response to a domestic violence call. What I'm trying to get across is, if you want to get information from a domestic violence victim and be able to leave providing some meaningful intervention there, you need to sit down and make her feel comfortable to give it up. If she's afraid of you, if she's intimidated, she's not going to tell you anything. It's a quick way to dump the call, however. If you really don't like this and this isn't your thing, it is. You can just go in and out and not communicate and solve the problem for that night. You won't do anything about solving the problem from then on, but it's a quick way to get out of it. We talk about not judging victims. And the examples I use are things like, if she dresses a little trashy, don't judge her. We're talking about police officers. We apply the law. We look at the law. We look at probable cause. It's not our position to make judgments on what these victims dress like, how they talk. Maybe she's had some alcohol. Maybe you suspect that she uses drugs once in a while. That may be. It's a great way to self-medicate yourself if you're living in an abusive situation. I'm not saying it's right. What I'm saying is it should not interfere with our application of the law. An interesting experiment happened in Duluth, Minnesota. I work with a man by the name of Michael Paymarf in Duluth, Minnesota. We train law enforcement together. And he said, it's really interesting to note how officers' biases and prejudices come out with regard to arrest. So they did an experiment, and they had this video. And the video, in every case, the same thing happened. The same assault occurred each and every time, okay? The facts were never any different in these 3 videos. The first one, the officers got there, they talked to both people. The victim was, as we expect victims to be, crying, hysterical, a little freaking out. The guy was calm, cool, and collected. And the officers were asked at the end of the video, how many would you make an arrest? Well, about 85% of them raised their hands. The next video, same set of facts, same assault, okay? Now they get there, and this woman has been drinking. Not drunk, but drinking, okay? Had a couple of drinks, but still articulate, gives all the facts, same assault, no difference. How many would make an arrest? Went down to 60%. Gee, she had a couple of drinks. I wonder if that really impacted the application of law here. And then the third one was the same video, same facts, same assault. Not only has she had a drink now, but she's yelling at the cops when they get there. God damn it, what took you so long? I thought he was going to kill him. And she's a little abusive to the cops. How many are you going to arrest now? Boy, it went way down. Okay? And the bottom line is, we're not supposed to respond to attitude like that. Okay? When we do, you know what? We're down at their level then. We're down at their level. We are supposed to apply the law as it's written. That's our job. That's what we get paid to do. Serve and protect and apply the law without prejudice, without bias. We even tell our cops in San Diego what semantics to use when they question people, and it may seem simplistic to you, but it really does work. Let me give you a couple examples. When our cops get to the scene and they're looking for history of past domestic violence, they don't say, has this ever happened before? Because our cops know it certainly has happened before. The FBI stats say there are 35 incidents of domestic violence before the victim will pick up the phone and call for help. Okay? So by the time we've gotten there, that victim's gotten over so many obstacles and hurdles to call you, it's happened before. There's a history. So you say, how many times has this happened before? That doesn't allow her any opportunity to say, it's the first time it ever happened, he's never done this before. BS. It's not. It never is. We also ask things like, if we can see an obvious injury, we want to know where the other injuries on the body are, okay? If we see a black eye, that's one thing. But we want to find out where all the other injuries are, and we cannot always see it under clothes and things like that. Or if someone got hit on the back of the head, you know, we want to know they got hit on the back of the head so we can put gloves on and feel for bumps on the head, because that's evidence of an injury. So we tell our officers, don't ask about injuries, ask about marks and bruises. That's how lay people refer to stuff. They don't think of it as injury. You say injury to a lay person, they think gunshot, stab wound. You want to know where the rest of the marks and bruises are. And when we are in a situation where we cannot step in and make an arrest, which I have to tell you is very easy in California. We've got 32 penal code violations that we use as tools to make an arrest. But when that is absent and we must ask this woman to place him under arrest in a misdemeanor situation, then we tell them to sell the arrest. And this is how they sell the arrest. In the old days, we would have said, you don't want to prosecute this guy, do you? I mean, you're going to have to take time off from work. You're going to have to go down and testify. You know, he's going to lose his job. You're going to be out the money. That's how you dump it. That's how you make the case go away. We've done that for years, very successfully. But now we don't want that to happen. We want intervention because guess what? We don't want to go to these homes week and month and year after year because we're not doing anything effective. So now we tell them to sell the arrest. And this is how we sell it. When we look at victims, we say, you want him to get help, don't you? Yes, they all wanted to get help. They all wanted to stop. Nobody likes to get beat. They just don't want to have to make the arrest because now they're responsible. And we say things like, you wanted to stop, you wanted to get help, don't you? So we sell it. We can sell in police work. We're very good at selling just about anything we want to sell. So all you have to do is realize this should be a high priority in your agency and learn how to sell it. Sell an arrest. Sell the report. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to cut to the chase and hit a couple of big things here. Let's talk about manipulation of police officers by batterers. The guys are very good at manipulating. They really are. It's worked for years. We get to the scene, he's calm, cool, and collected. She's screaming and hysterical. She may even go up to his face when you're there because guess what? She feels safe. The training partner that I work with is vertically challenged. He's short. His name's Michael Paymore, and he says he completely understands why women will all of a sudden really freak out when the cops get there. You know why? Because they feel safe. And this is a story he told me. He said he was in about 4th grade. He was walking home from school one day, and these guys, this gang of guys about 2 years older than him, about 3 of them came up to him, and they'd given him a hard time because he's Jewish, backed him into a corner, you know, hey, Michael, 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 and he's like really scared, right? But then, about 30 seconds later, comes his older brother, who's like 3 years older than these guys with a couple of his buddies. And he saw them, and they yelled over, hey, Michael, what's going on? And guess what happened? He got right up and said, yeah, asshole, what's going on? I mean, he felt safe. Well, guess what? That's what victims do. It doesn't mean she's the cause of the problem. It means you've arrived and she feels safe and she's really pissed off because he just beat the crap out of her and now you're there. So when that happens, don't be fooled. It's going to happen. Also, our batterers try to manipulate by buddying up with the cops. God forbid they were in the same, you know, military section, because I've seen that happen, you know, where, oh yeah, you want to go in the house, you want to see the insignia from the Marine Corps, yeah, where are we stationed, all this stuff, and all of a sudden it's like they're talking sports and talking military activity and stuff like that, and things don't happen the way that they should. So what I'm suggesting to you is don't let your officers, and if you're an officer, don't let the batterer put one over on you. Believe me, sit in a group sometime with 6 or 7 batterers and let them tell you how they've done this for years. Okay, let's talk about self-defense. We don't put people in jail for self-defense in San Diego, okay? I will not tell you we never arrest them. Sometimes they do get arrested. We are fortunate in that we have a domestic violence unit, and even when our inexperienced cops screw up and arrest somebody for self-defense, we're generally there to kind of bail them out. And there are ways that you can detect self-defense, very easy ways, and what it comes down to is the kind of wounds you're seeing. Now, I don't know what you do here in Montana if both have injuries. What happens when both have injuries at the scene? Huh?
Both go to jail.
Both go to jail? Both go to jail? Do you do much investigation about was somebody defending themselves? Well, let me put this out. We didn't. We used to put a lot of people, I mean, both people in jail. Now it's down to like less than 2% of our arrests are mutual arrest. First of all, because we just wasted all that money and time and effort because they're not going to be prosecuted when both are put in jail. It's not going to happen. It doesn't balance out in the courtroom. So all that time and effort we put into it, it just doesn't work. In San Diego, we look at primary aggressor, and we also looked at was there a self-defense issue there. And the Constitution in this country ensures people to be free from physical harm. So if you're investigating a situation where one person was being assaulted and the other person was defending themselves, and you find that out in your investigation, you should not put that person in jail. It's not a crime to defend yourself anywhere in the country. The way that we recognize it are these things. Scratches on the victim's body. The scratches come from nails. Nails are a weapon for women. Okay, they're an equalizer. We're generally less socially violent. We're less of a physical size than men, and so we use whatever weapons we have at our disposal when we're in fear of our safety. And so when we see a victim, a batterer, a guy who's got scratches on his face or chest, or even on the neck area here, you know, that's the first indication you better be exploring self-defense. Another thing is bite marks on the chest or the stomach area. And the first case that we had in like this was really interesting. It came into the unit, and we're looking at it and everything, and we're thinking, now, think about this in a common sense fashion. How likely it is that this 5'2" woman who weighed 120 pounds ran up to this 6-foot guy and bit him right in the stomach and just caused this whole thing to happen? Not bloody likely. What really happens and why people get bitten on the stomach and on the chest area is they're either held up against a wall or held on the floor with their head being smashed on the floor, because batterers know when they hit your head that a lot of cops won't go looking for bumps on your head. So they bite them on the chest or the stomach to get away. Again, I repeat, it's not against the law to defend yourself. And that's the only thing that gets you out of it. Do it. Another thing is a bite mark under the arm. When you see a bite mark under the arm on the guy, you probably had her in a chokehold. Think about it. How would you get out if you were being choked? So there are things that you can do. And we interview before we put on handcuffs. If we find out a self-defense issue, we don't take the person to jail. The last thing I want to talk about is facing your own stuff. I think the reason that cops have a problem with domestic violence is we don't face our own stuff. I'm going to talk about male entitlement, which always seems to shake up groups of people, but I really believe, and we have been teaching this now for 3 years, male entitlement and all that infers really negatively impacts the application of the law on domestic violence. And let me give you a couple of perfect examples of it. We had a victim come into our station about 3 years ago, a blind woman who was living with a guy who was abusive. And we thought when she first came in, she brought her her walking seeing eye dog. And I didn't write the report because, well, y'all know sergeants don't write reports. We just kind of order cops to write reports. So I went down with her because she wanted somebody to stay with her. And I got a cop off of the front counter, and I said, we're going to interview this lady, and you're going to write a report. So we're sitting there and listening to her give the story. And I thought it was just threatening violence, and she was afraid, and that's the kind of report. But midway through it, she said that the guy grabbed a hold of her, and she tried to get away, and he grabbed her arm. Well, look, there were no injuries or anything like that, and we got done, and she left, and I said to the cop, well, what are you going to make the report? And he says he was going to make it, and he used the code number in California that's just threats of violence and injury. I said, why aren't you going to make it battery? You know, it was grabbing the arm. He said, well, he was just trying to get her attention. I said, no. You don't do that with a partner who's an adult. That's not how you get someone's attention. You don't, against their will, grab their arm and have that be okay. That's not condoned. So we had a long talk about it, and culture played an important factor here because the cop was Puerto Rican. Puerto Rican, Hispanic, there's a lot of, and I know because that's my area of the city, there is a lot of cultural influence on a man's right to be physical with a woman. And anybody who says this doesn't play a part in it is being naive about the issue of domestic violence, because it certainly does impact it. The other example is this. We had a woman who she worked at a bar, the bar closed, she was there at about 2:30 in the morning, having a couple drinks with a couple of male friends. She lives with a guy who came to take her out of the bar. He was really incensed that she was in the bar and said, I want you to come home with me. And this guy's been abusive in the past. In fact, he's been arrested for domestic violence. She said, I don't want to go. He said, I don't care. I want you to come with me. I don't want you staying here talking to these guys. This woman's 38 years old. So he bodily picks her up and drags her out of the bar, and she's kicking and screaming, and she gets some injuries on him. He's got injuries on her. The case comes into the unit, and we had a long discussion about the fact that she had been arrested. We had a city attorney that day who was going through our cases, and it was amazing because even one of the other detectives in the unit, and he's since then seen the light, comment to me was, well, I would have done the same thing. I used to be married to an alcoholic. And I said, wait a second. I don't care who you were married to. We're talking about the application of the law. You may not approve of the fact that she's in there at 2:30 in the morning drinking. That does not give him the right to go in and physically take her out. We apply the law. We're police officers. We don't pass judgment. We apply the law and we serve and protect. That's our job. So just a couple of examples about how male entitlement issues, and I don't want to go on and on, I'm not a psychologist about it, but I do know that it really negatively impacts how we treat domestic violence in law enforcement. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I'm going to be doing a presentation tomorrow, and you may have questions, and I want to be able to have time to address any of the questions you may have. I do want to tell you one other thing. I've got a couple of handouts here. One of them is the numbers that I put up there that show the correlation of reports going up and homicides coming down, which you can take if you like, and I'll put it back there. The other thing is, in San Diego, back in 1992, we developed a form. This is in your materials, and it's right behind Casey Gwynn's information in the first part. But we developed this report because we wanted to get full crime reports. We wanted a crime investigation. So one of our police officers put together this domestic violence supplemental because we were requiring so much information in order to really proceed with prosecution in these cases that we didn't want cops to have to write out a 20-page narrative. So the cop put together this form, and it's excellent. We have a crime report form, and then every domestic violence case has to have one of these forms attached. And it really kind of keys in on the kinds of information that a detective would need or a prosecutor would need to really successfully prosecute. It asks things about the relationship between the victim, who called the police, what state you found the victim in and the suspect in, what were the spontaneous statements that they made that you can put in quotes that you could use later in court even if you lose the victim down the road. And it asks questions about medical treatment, prior history, any evidence collected. On the other side, we have body diagrams, so it's really easy to put up in court and say, yeah, well, she got a black eye here and she got a scratch there, and if you check it off in the box, there's really no mistake by the time the detective gets it or the prosecutor gets it. The only other thing I wanted to comment on is we have our cops spending the time necessary now in these calls that they have never spent before. And the way we sold it to them was this. We asked them, why do you make drunk driving arrests? They all said, because drunk drivers kill people, okay? And we say, okay, how long does it take to write a drunk driving arrest? Well, depending on if the cop is fast or slow, it takes anywhere from 1 hour to 3 hours. Make the arrest, do the field coordination test, make the arrest, take them to jail, write the report, okay? Why do you think they spend 3 hours on DUI reports? Well, because drunk drivers kill people, right? They kill. Well, so does domestic violence. And it leads to a lot of other stuff. So why do we want to get in and out in 20 minutes? This is a crime. That means you respond, you get the information, you get the statements, you take the photos, you impound the evidence, you ask for the 911 tape, you do the job. It is a crime. It's not just a dispute. And since they've been doing that, we've had a lot more success with our prosecution. They're really treating it as a crime now. I have to tell you, we haven't for a long time. Do you have any questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, as a lawyer who frequently is defending some of these gals in a contested thing where the husband's trying to say, no, we don't want an injunction, we're fine, no problem. We're trying to get these reports that you guys are so methodically making to get a history, to show a common plan. I've had one guy that's abused 3 women in a row. And do you think I could get a copy of that report of how he tuned up the other 2 women? Not on my life. It's a violation of his privacy. To me, you've got some good information, but how do you get it out there so that I can fry him when he takes the stand and says that this is just a...
All I can say is probably your courts haven't caught up with the times yet, and after you start hearing from Casey Gwynn today, he could talk to you about how we made the change in San Diego. Back in 1987, we prosecuted a municipal court judge for domestic violence, and at that time, in 87, we could not enter in the 911 tape, we couldn't enter in the information about his prior violence and his prior marriages, couldn't enter into the fact that the victim had gotten a TRO, and we lost the case. But that was because we didn't have our judiciary trained to understand why it was in their best interest as a part of this system to do the right thing. And it's like methodically overcome in any community by constant approaching the bench and trying to push this in, trying to push that in, case law, precedent-making cases, and that type of thing. It doesn't happen overnight, but it will happen. You just need to push for it. But I know, and there are still judges, I'm sure, in different jurisdictions that are so Neanderthal in behavior that they would, certainly never let any of that stuff come in. But they are becoming fewer and fewer of them. So it's just kind of a learning process for a community, I think. Any other questions? Thanks for listening.